Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Jyoti, and I manage the software donation program here at NASCOM Foundation. I have Mahindra with me, who looks after the software donation program at NASCOM Foundation. We will start the session with a little bit of housekeeping. All the lines have been muted. And in case if you have any technical issues during the session, please type it in the chat box, which is on your webinar panel. And if you have any questions during the webinar, please type it in the Q&A box. If you are on a Wi-Fi connection and have multiple programs open, this sometimes may affect the quality of the audio and the video of the webinar. If possible, close all the other programs to have the best experience. The webinar will be recorded, and the recorded link will be available on the NASCOM Foundation YouTube page. So I would like to welcome Mahindra.
Thanks, Jyoti. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. Today we want to talk about piracy and how it can help you in your operational, or how it can help you in your daily goals of what you want to achieve as part of your NGOs goals. So let's move on, Jyoti. So we are part of Tech for Good team, where we are transforming through Tech for Good, and we as NASCOM Foundation are focused on unlocking the power of technology by creating access and opportunity for those who need it the most. Next page, please. So here I just want to give a quick overview of what is our vision. So we are looking at leveraging technology to create an inclusive and progressive India. So basically, we have been established in 2001, and our mission is, looking at using technology-led innovations which can drive impact. A quick glance about what is NASCOM Foundation all about. It's India's only neutral, not-for-profit entity representing tech industry. We have a very strong nationwide presence to facilitate the last mile impact, and we have been in this industry for the last 20 years. And we are focused on main impact streams, which is digital literacy, skilling and employability, and women entrepreneurship. So our focus areas are also aligned with the India SDG index, and our programs, which I just mentioned, like digital literacy, skilling and employability, women entrepreneurship, where we focus on inclusion, solutions for good, big tech program, and innovation. These are some of the programs, and we as Tech for Good are cutting across all these programs to kind of focus on the SDG goals which we have. Just to talk about what has been our impact in 2021, we have impacted over 5 lakhs disadvantaged lives, and over 3 lakhs lives transformed through digital literacy, skilling, and entrepreneurship. We have almost like 1,600 lives who have been transformed through diverse and inclusive initiatives, and over 2 lakhs lives transformed through our Tech for Good initiatives. And we are currently running around 25 plus projects with 25 plus donors. Just to give a quick overview about Big Tech, Big Tech is an initiative basically where we are in association with TechSoup. It's a only platform available in India through which NGOs can get genuine software at an affordable price. Let's move on. So what problem Big Tech is trying to address? So I just want to talk a little bit about what we are doing and what are the solutions and how NGOs can get benefited, right? So NGOs have financial limitations to be able to invest in IT infrastructure, may it be a hardware or a software. They cannot afford to hire a professional services to deploy the latest technology. And there's also lack of awareness and knowledge of what products are available in the market, right? And there is also a lot of pirated software that is available, which is unauthorized and unreliable. So what we as Big Tech will provide as a solution is basically we provide affordable latest technology and we provide access to the donated products and a wealth of technology content which you can access on the Big Tech, and also access to the communities of the support. And how NGOs can get benefited, they can enhance the reach to the beneficiaries and sponsors, and improve internal efficiencies and resources, and also market and brand themselves better. Here in the slide, just talking about what are the products and solutions which are available. So before that, I also want to talk about what we as Big Tech have, have had an impact basically. So we have donated worth 155 million softwares to across 1300 plus NGOs, which is impacting about 2 million plus lives across India. And I don't want to go into details of what all donors we have, but what all solutions, like we have solutions in infrastructure, finance and accounting, marketing and comms, donor management, security and backup, and also operations. So these are some of the solutions which you can find on Big Tech, and you can find the respective donors who are listed where you can get your softwares. This slide, quickly shows a quick overview about some of the donors who are available, like Google for nonprofit, Microsoft, Symantec. So some of these are listed on our Big Tech platform. So with that, let me welcome Anisha Kaushi. She is our speaker for today, and she specializes in the area of privacy, AI, emerging technologies, as well as governance and digital ethics. So over to you, Anisha. Thank you.
Thanks, Mahindra. Thanks, everyone at the NASCOM Foundation team. Hopefully, I'm audible and clear to everyone. I will quickly just share my screen, and then we can start the session. Hold on. Okay, this is great. Just give me 1 second. Let me just start. All right. So today's session is, everyone who's joined here knows that today's session is to discuss the nature of privacy and the nature of data protection legislation and the landscape at the moment in India. The operative word in the heading, in the introduction, would be current, because the data regulation platform in India, or just data legislation, keeps changing and it keeps evolving. It's never set in stone. It's constantly dynamic. It's informed by industry. It's informed by governance. It's informed by a whole host of different things. So current is the operative term here. So my session will fundamentally talk about the nature of data protection and the nature of privacy around NGOs, and some of the regulation that surrounds it, as well as sort of contextualized around the Joint Parliamentary Committee's report on the Data Protection Bill that came out in September 2021. So before we begin, I quickly just want to talk about DSCI. So I am in the policy team at DSCI. DSCI is the Data Security Council of India. What we essentially do is that we are a non-for-profit think tank that comes under the purview of NASCOM, but the responsibilities that we look at, the area that we look at, is a little bit more niche, in that we look at data protection, we look at cybersecurity, we look at privacy, emerging technologies, etc. So before we begin our conversation, and this is important for everybody who is in the data protection ecosystem, all of us, right? To understand a few positioning of who we are and how we play roles in that ecosystem. So all of us, everybody here, all of us is a data principal. All of us have one responsibility. Our data is accessed and used, and we often consent and give it to organizations or entities who want to have access to our data, and they process it. Very rarely do we as data principals, that each of us as individuals, process other people's data. Very rarely do we do it. We don't have the time, we don't have the resources, we don't have the capability, but all of us are data principals. So we are the units that produce the data for entities and companies and governments, etc. The other side of that spectrum is that you have data fiduciaries, right? Data fiduciaries essentially are the people that process the data of the data principals. So while each one of us is a data principal, each and every NGO here, each and every organization here is a data fiduciary as well. The data fiduciary is the organization or the entity that collects the data from the data principal and uses it for whatever purpose that they want to use it for. So they describe the purview of what the data is being collected for and how it's being used within that organizational structure. So the people that collect the data very easily is known as data fiduciary in the Indian legislation. In the GDPR, for example, in the EU, they're called as data controllers, but that's not necessary but for our conversation. So we'll keep it a data fiduciary. And we, every single person on this chat, on this webinar, is a data principal. So we play two roles. As an individual, we play the role of a data principal, and as an organization, we play the role of a data fiduciary. So now I just want to talk a bit about data taxonomy. I know these are basics, but I think it's imperative that we go through them to make sure that we're not losing our thread of thought at any point. So what is data? Data is generally any sort of tiny tidbit of information that they have on you. So it can be digital information, it can be general sort of analog information, whatever information, like a small, tiny chunk of information that they have on you is called data. But what makes data personal? If that data can identify a natural person, that is, they can identify a human being at the end of it. So your name, your phone number, your Aadhaar number, let's say your house address, whatever, is a direct identifier to you as a living human being. When that element of identity comes into that little tidbit of information, that entity then becomes personal data. It's associated to one living person. It's associated to one human being, right? And you can identify, anybody can look at an Excel sheet and look at my name, look at my company, and very easily be able to identify that I am Anisha that works at NASCOM, right? That's a very clear strategy to identify who I am. So that data is attached to me, is attached to my personality and attached to my identity. So when data is attached to somebody's identity, in that you can identify a person based on that little tidbit, that is known as personal data. Now, any data that is not attached to a particular individual, but is just data that's available, for example, let's say weather data, or census data, or statistical data, just data that exists that has nothing to do with the human person, then that data is called as non-personal data. So all data that is not personal data is fundamentally non-personal data. That you can't identify to a person is relegated as non-personal data. For the purposes of our conversation, we will only be sticking to personal data because that's where maximum regulation, maximum compliance is around, right? So personal data is data that identifies a person. Now there are subsets within the JPC report on the data protection, right? The first subset is sensitive personal data. Now sensitive personal data essentially is a subset of personal data that is measured based on the harms it can cause if that data is leaked or released publicly. Let's say, for example, that if my name is just released publicly, the consequences are bad maybe in particular instances, but they're not always bad. But let's say that you're releasing my name along with my ethnic identity, my sexual orientation, if I have an intersex status, then that along with, let's say, my health benefits, my health data, my financial data, all of that has massive consequences on my civil liberties and my personal freedoms, right? So none of us want to be racially profiled. None of us want to be caste profiled. None of us want to be discriminated on the basis of anything. So sensitive personal data is a subgroup of personal data that if that data is released, then it has an adverse effect, or if that data is somehow, used in a wrongful manner, it has adverse effects on your civil liberties and your personal freedoms, right? So that's personal data. It's a high risk subsection of all personal data is sensitive personal data. Now, in the data protection bill, there's also a purview for something which is called as critical personal data. Now, critical personal data is not defined in the bill in that it doesn't say these are the factors that make up something as critical personal data. It's something that the government wants to decide as it goes along. So it's not a clear boundary of what critical personal data is, but based on assessment, we can say that it's an even more tight group version of sensitive personal data. It's extremely, let's say, sensitive personal data can be categorized as critical data. Let's say data that can have serious adverse effects on you as an individual. Let's say you are a victim of domestic abuse and you've gone to, let's say, witness protection, etc. So data that has extreme relevance to you as a person and has extreme consequences if released, then might become critical personal data. But at the moment, we don't know the exact boundaries of what categorizes critical personal data, and it's just left this way to be defined by the Data Protection Authority when it is set up. So this is the entire purview of data taxonomy, or the words that we generally use around personal data. Now I will move on to talk about the classification of sensitive personal data. This is exactly what we spoke about. So sensitive personal data is a subset of personal data. It is sensitive because it is related to the data principles, fundamental rights and freedoms. So if I'm racially profiled, I'm actively profiled against, opportunities are taken away from me, maybe my sort of civil liberties are being impeded on. So to ensure that that does not happen, sensitive personal data is reclassified under the Data Protection Bill. Now, why this is important, extremely important to us, is that as NGOs, most of us have a host of sensitive personal data. In fact, we work with more sensitive personal data than we work with anything else. So it's really important that we understand the kind of compliance around sensitive personal data, the kind of challenges in collecting personal data, storing, processing. All of these data processing activities then become all the more tricky because you're dealing with such sensitive data. Right? So the risk becomes higher, compliance penalties become higher. So it's important that we are aware of the challenges that we have when we're dealing with a particular section of data. Now, this is just a quick comparison. So if you look down, you'll be able to see that in the Data Protection Bill 2021, these are some of the big points that are classified as sensitive personal data. So you can take a look and see if your organization collects this particular subgroup of data and see if you are actually an organization that deals with sensitive personal data. So the first is obviously financial data, and based on the classification of financial data, it's quite broad. So by financial data, we mean even data, even your phone number that's associated to a particular bank account can still be considered financial data, right? Your account number is financial data. Any sort of transactional details with a bank or a neobank or a fintech agency, especially NGOs that deal with grassroots sort of financial adoption, etc. Financial data, sensitivity around financial data becomes extremely important. So your financial data, health data, sex life, sexual orientation, biometric data, genetic data, transgender status, intersex status, all of these, caste, religious and political beliefs, all of this is sensitive data because all of this can be used, actively used against you to profile or actively used against you to discriminate. So that's why it's classified this way. All right, so if you take a look at this group, you'll be able to see if you are an organization that fundamentally deals with this subsection of data and what the preventive mechanisms are. We'll discuss that soon. What are the preventive mechanisms are to make sure that you're not being liable or you don't have liabilities coming at you. Okay, so when you process sensitive data, let's assume that you process one or more of these subgroups, right? Some of the factors that you want to keep in mind is the first is explicit consent. Now, consent is a word that I think is thrown around a lot, or at least over the past 10 years, it's got a lot of traction. When we say explicit consent, we mean a couple of things. The first is informed, active, enthusiastic consent. So informed meaning that the person who's giving consent, that's you and I, the data principal who's giving consent to the data fiduciary, must know for what, how, and why their data is being processed. That is how, why, and in what way the processing is happening. That consent is really, that sort of clarity around the information of why your data is being processed is really important. So the first is informed consent. The other is enthusiastic consent, in that you can't have pre-ticked boxes. So sometimes you see when you're on particular websites and they have access to cookies, even before you've ticked the box is already ticked for you, right? So it's pre-ticked consent. You're not actually explicitly giving them consent. They're assuming consent on your behalf, which is wrong, right? So for the processing of personal data, sensitive personal data, it's extremely important that the person who's giving consent is actively giving that consent, is making an informed decision to give you that consent, is not just doing it passively. So active consent becomes an important thing. Another one is enthusiastic consent. So you can't persuade or you can't coerce somebody into giving a consent, right? You can't say, if you don't give consent, then this is the service that we can't provide you. You can't use that against somebody. You can tell them that particular services might not be available because we need your data to do something. You can be convincing, you can't be persuasive, you can't be coercive in getting consent. So that is what we mean by explicit consent, right? That's one cornerstone of processing sensitive personal data. In fact, in the data protection bill, you have to have you have to have explicit consent in order to process sensitive personal data. Without it, it's impossible to process sensitive personal data by any entity, right? The other sort of factors that you want to keep in mind, one is the data protection impact assessment. Now, what we mean by the data protection impact assessment is that an impact assessment that is taken within the organization or for particular projects to see, or particular initiatives or particular wings or whatever, to see the sort of risks, the privacy risks that are attached to that particular project. Now, if there are too many privacy risks that are attached to a particular project, then you want to think of mitigating strategies. You want to think of ways in which that you can realign and make sure that the privacy of the people that you are processing data for is not challenged at any point, right? So data protection impact assessment then becomes a really important step before you start any project. You want to do it to make sure that the privacy of the individual and the security of the individual, that's the data security of the individual, is ensured from the get-go. Another sort of requirement for processing sensitive personal data now is data localization. Now, what we mean by data localization is that in the Joint Parliamentary Committee report, it very clearly says that if you want to process sensitive personal data and you want to transfer that data outside of India. Now, as most NGOs, they might have sort of partner organizations in different countries. You might be a particular chapter or a wing that's currently based in India. So you might want to process your data or send your data outside of India to get it processed. If that is the case, that is, if there is any cross-border data transfer that's happening, then you have to have at least one copy of the data, at least one, residing in India. So this is soft localization. At least one copy of that data must reside in India, but you can transfer data based on the explicit consent of the principal. You can transfer the data outside of India, but at least one copy must be stored in local servers within the Indian geography. So it must be housed in India. So that's another requirement. Another sort of requirement now is the presence of a data protection officer. So even small and medium enterprises now start, even if it's a joint responsibility, even if it's not an explicit responsibility, will have somebody taking on the role of the data protection officer, especially if they are working with large volumes of data. Right? If you are a highly digitized, or even if you're not a highly digitized, you have a digital arm, then you do have a data protection officer in charge of doing the data protection assessment, doing the records of processing activities, just overseeing the data protection or the data governance regime of the organization. Right? So now another requirement for sensitive personal data processing is the presence of a data protection officer. I'll quickly just go over records of processing activities. It's good practice for enterprises that deal with sensitive personal data to have or to maintain records of processing activity, especially because in the case of sensitive personal data, because the risk is so high, in case there is a compliance liability at some point, or in case there is a leak or an access like a data storage leak or some sort of bad activity that happens around your data, you want to be able to show that the records of processing on your end was straightforward and clear, and you can show line of control essentially. So records of processing activity is another best practice that you want to implement from the get-go when you're working with sensitive personal data. All right. I know I'm running through these things. The reason is I want to cover some big topics before the questions come up. In case you have questions, I really encourage you to drop it in the chat. But yeah, I'm sorry if I'm rushing through this. The paucity of time is, I'm cognizant of that. Okay. So around sensitive personal data, or just personal data generally, for an organization, there's a number of privacy risks. So one is unauthorized disclosure. So there might be cases in which even without you knowing, or even without you actively being cognizant about it, you might have an unauthorized disclosure of the data from your organization, right? So that's an accidental leak, for example. Another is you might be collecting a lot of data, but you internally might not know where the chain of control or where the data is going, who in your organization has access to it. So for a data principle, that's a lot of lack of transparency. So they're like, what exactly are you using my data for? I don't know the reason for processing. I know you're sending it from this group to this group to that group. That's all I know. I just don't know exactly what my data is being used for. I don't know if it's used to profile against me. I don't know if it's used for any sort of harm against me. I have no clarity into this. So that is a huge privacy risk for an organization. So the lack of transparency and the lack of not knowing how data flows are happening within the organization. The other is excessive data collection, which is sometimes, especially as small and medium level organizations, we don't know the amount of data we need. So we tend to over collect. So let's say because we don't know what exactly we want to do with the data later on, we have a tendency to take more data, to collect more data in the beginning than less. So because we don't know the limitations of the purpose that we're collecting data for, we just tend to sort of grab everything that we have. So if it's like an onboarding form, or if it's sort of like a check-in form or whatever, in whichever ways in which you're collecting, even if it's a platform that you have, right? Let's say an app or something, you're still excessively collecting data because you don't know exactly what this data is going to be used for later. So you're erring on the side of caution by saying, oh, we'll collect more data. And then if there's a problem later on, then we'll work it out. So that again is a huge risk because we have to store all of this data and store it well, right? So let's say, for example, if you have a whole host of data, storage costs increase. Apologize for my background. Storage costs increase, and we generally have a lot more challenges around maintaining that data, retaining that data, and then even deleting the data at the end of it when we over collect data. So that's another sort of privacy risk that we come across quite often. The third issue is third-party data sharing. That's when, let's say, you're outsourcing data for particular, like let's say there are outsourcing things, right? Obviously, we don't do everything in-house. There are particular parts of our activities for which we might be outsourcing to different organizations. In that case, we don't know what the best practices of that organization are. While our best practices might be great and might be impeccable, we don't know their standards. So that might be one level of challenge where you don't know the standard of how well their data protection regimens are. And another is, let's say you're sharing data with another organization as part of a collaborative exercise, or you've tied up with a different entity for a particular project, etc. You still don't know how well they're going to take care of this data, if they will treat it badly, and then that'll end up being released to the public. Still, there's a lot of compliance that will come to you. There's a lot of challenges that will come to you because they will say you were the person that collected the data. You were the data fiduciary. When you shared it with a third party, you had a responsibility to ensure that the data was protected. And because it wasn't, you have challenges that are arising because of that. So that's another issue that we come across quite often. The third, as I mentioned before, is data storage. Right? Everybody likes data. Everybody likes collecting data. Everybody sort of is very excited about the analytical prosperity of data. All of that is fantastic. The struggle really is when you can't maintain the data that you've collected, right? So when you take all of this data, you have to be able to store it in house, or you have to get cloud service providers on board to be able to house your data. You want to be able to process that data, check the retention value of particular types of data. Let's say some sectors, for example, will have different standards. So let's say the healthcare sector says you need to store data only for 8 years. So at the end of 8 years, you need to go back and say, okay, all of this data needs to be deleted now. I need to send a notice to the person to tell them that I'm deleting your data. All of this becomes massive organizational, institutional, and financial challenges. Especially if you're a small and medium level organization, it becomes a massive challenge to take care of all of this data storage. So these are the big privacy risks that we come across, right? So generally, these are the broad categories. Now, just across the board, now there is a lot of privacy trends that you see coming up now as solutions to these problems. So they say, okay, all of these are our problems. How do we try and fix it? A couple of these, I'm not going to go into the details because it's not necessarily important at this juncture. But some of the ways in which you do it is, for example, you have anonymization. Anonymization is a technical intervention where you take personal data and you do a technical intervention on top of it, which essentially makes personal data non-personal data. So suddenly your compliance costs have gone down, no? Because it's not personal data. Your liabilities are not that high. So even if your data is released, it's not like you're releasing personal data, you're releasing non-personal data, and it's a breach. The compliance charges are not that high. It's something that you can navigate much easier. So one of the interventions is anonymization, and the way you do it is called de-identification. So you're de-identifying personal data, you're removing the identifier and making it non-personal data. This, for example, is one. Privacy by design is another thing that you hear a lot about, which is you design products from the beginning, or systems or structures or whatever from the beginning with privacy in mind. So it's not retroactively done. So it's not like you have an institution and then you're trying to bring in privacy. You develop with privacy in as the goal. So whatever you do, you make sure that at every stage, privacy is taken care of. There are no privacy challenges, and then you build that. So that's another way of doing this. So these are just like global trends of some of the interventions that enterprises and companies and NGOs have been trying to do in order to eliminate or make sure or stay away from compliance challenges. So now that we know that this is all of the risks, and there is really harsh regulation around privacy, as there rightly should be, because the right to privacy is a fundamental right. For any enterprises that challenges your right to privacy, there should be, there should be challenges. It should be judicially difficult and legislatively difficult to, impede on somebody's right to privacy. There are a couple of strategies that we can enforce to make sure that our organization is not, our organization is essentially not getting into a compliance loophole at some point. So one of the ways in which you can do it is visibility over personal information. That is going back to my point earlier, which is knowing the trajectory of where data is in your organization. So knowing the start points. If you collect data at particular start points, let's say you have an app that maybe collects data, or you have on-ground volunteers that collect data, or you might have, let's say, an onboarding system that might collect data. Know your access points, know where your data comes in from, and know where your data goes, and fundamentally what this data is being used for. So there's a couple of strategies, right? One you can think of, for example, is you can say, okay, we don't have a research and analytics way. We use it only for a particular type of processing. And that's as far as the data will go. So we just need to protect that particular aspect, right? So knowing visibility into the pipeline of where your data is in your organization is maybe the most important step, is the important first step that you need to take. Because otherwise you will always have streams of data that you don't know who has access to, how many people within your organization, how many people outside your organization have access to this stream of data. And anytime, in case there's a leak, or in case there is some sort of hack, that's the first place that they will go, and they will be like, you had no visibility into this particular aspect of your organization itself, which is bad practice. So this is the first place to start, knowing where data is going. The second is obviously thinking of privacy and privacy organization and relationships. That's tying up with organizations that lead privacy, implementation within organizations, privacy intake within organizations. So I know this might be a bit of a challenge, given the nature of particular organizations. It might be difficult to hire a privacy compliance organization to come in and advise you on these things. But even if you don't outsource it, even doing it in-house through, let's say, a data protection impact assessment, or even just having a DPO to look over these strategies to make sure that somebody is actually taking this as a responsibility and making sure that they know where data is going, where the privacy challenges are, what are the types of data that they have. Even just initial starting points are really good measures to mitigate trouble later on. So even if we don't go the whole mile, just starting off from softer areas is all right. Another thing I think is really important, especially for NGOs, is privacy awareness and training, right? Because of the nature of on-ground volunteers, or the nature of volunteers or the community generally, it becomes really important to make sure that these individuals are aware of the privacy of the data principle that they're collecting data from, that they know the situations around consent, that they are able to communicate what consent is clearly to this person. They're able to communicate what this data is being used for, how the data will be used, and what are some of maybe the risks and challenges of using that data. So just making sure that the volunteers, the on-ground folk, or even just organizationally, everybody is aware of the nature of privacy and how privacy can be implemented can be a very good first step as well. Privacy monitoring again goes back to the responsibility of a DPO. You want him to, or you want her to make sure that privacy generally as an organizational best practice is implemented slowly but surely from day one, right? I'm not going to go into more of the details of this because I do realize that, especially with smaller entities, it becomes really difficult to enforce privacy on a large scale level. It becomes very difficult to do it, let's say, on the level of an Infosys or a Wipro, and that's anyway not a responsibility anyway, because those are organizations with massive amounts of data, and they use it for research analytics. We use it for very particular reasons, very specific reasons in very small amounts. So it's not necessary that we go that far, but it is still important that these principles are kept in mind. All right, so as data fiduciaries, there's also one other point that I want to point out, which is some of us might be significant data fiduciaries. Now, what is a significant data fiduciary? A significant data fiduciary essentially is a data fiduciary that processes large amounts of data or data that is highly sensitive and might cause a lot of harm to the person, to the data principal, if it's leaked, etc. So data fiduciary, you can think of yourself, so at the moment, there's no clear distinction of who a data fiduciary is. It just says that the DPA will be authorized to describe who a significant data fiduciary is and who just a regular data fiduciary is. In the case of a significant data fiduciary, it just means that you either process large volumes of data, let's say like your Meta or your Wipro or whoever, like process large volumes of data, or you process data that is highly sensitive. So while we might not necessarily go the way of we process large amounts of data because we are by sheer volume, we might still be a significant data fiduciary because of the type of data that we are processing. Because we are processing sensitive, like really sensitive personal data, we might still be categorized as a significant data fiduciary. Now, how different is it from a data fiduciary? The first is you have to do a lot of data protection impact assessments for any projects or any wings or any sectors within the ecosystem. You have to make sure that privacy is being complied with at every step. Other one, again, is records of processing. The third is the significant data fiduciary might be subject to audits by the Data Protection Authority. So that's something that you might want to be cognizant about from day one, even though the Data Protection Authority is not yet set up. It's still something that you want to be cognizant about from day one. The other is, of course, the appointment of a data protection officer, as we mentioned before. And if you're a significant data fiduciary and you know you're a significant data fiduciary, it's mandated that you have to register yourself as one with the Data Protection Authority when it is set up. So this is another sort of requirement that we might have. All right, so now all of this is done to protect the right to privacy, right? The fundamental right to privacy of the individual is the reason why we have all of the above set up. All of the ecosystem exists to protect that. The data principal and the data fiduciaries work together to protect that. Now, apart from the overarching right to privacy, there are also sort of sub-rights that are given to the data principal, right? So and the organization, obviously in this particular case, has the obligation to make sure that that right is not infringed upon. So let's say one right, for example, is the right to confirmation and access. That means that a data principal can come to any one of your entities and ask, I know you collected my personal data. I want to know exactly what you're using it for. What exactly are you doing with it? Are you processing it? Who has access to it? Did you receive my data? Can I see what the processing is for, etc. Right? So you as an entity then have an obligation to convey to the data principal that these are the reasons for why we're processing your data. This is how the processing is done. This is the flow, etc. So you have that obligation, right? So it's necessary that, again, you have visibility into where your streams go. Another right, for example, is the right to be forgotten. The right to be forgotten is another right that's given to the data principal, which means that they can request that their data be removed from the entity's portal for any number of reasons. Let's say, for example, a classic example is if let's say you have an embarrassing picture of you up on Google. You can go up to Google and be like, see, listen, this is an embarrassing picture. It doesn't serve any purpose for anybody. This doesn't make any sense. Can I please have it taken down? And Google will then be required to be obligated to exercise your right to be forgotten and remove that picture, right? So that is the right to be forgotten. So the data principal has the right to approach the entity or the data fiduciary at any point and request that their right to be forgotten is enabled. Another is a right to data portability. The right to data portability is that if I have a lot of data with a particular bank, let's say, for example, right? So all my life I've worked with Canara Bank and all of my data exists with Canara Bank. Now I've decided to move banks. I want to move to HDFC. What do? I can't, all of the information that Canara Bank has collected on me for all these years, I don't want to give my information from day one again to HDFC. I should be able to port my data from Canara Bank to HDFC with the least amount of restrictions or with like a reasonable sense of ease, right? So that is the right to data portability, the right for you to port data between different services. The last, of course, is the right to correction and erasure. There are more rights, but these, I think, are the overarching rights that you need to be aware of. Right to correction and erasure is if the data principal feels that a particular piece of data that you have on them is inaccurate, that they think that this is not accurate. Let's say you accidentally took down the wrong date of birth, or you accidentally took down their wrong maiden name, example. They can come back to you and request that that data be corrected. Or if the data is completely irrelevant for your processing, they can ask that the data be erased from your system so that you don't have access to that data anymore. Right? So this is the nature of some of the rights that are available to the data principal. The last part of this of the webinar today that I wanted to just take you through is, now that we know, okay, all of these are issues, all of these are problems. We've learned about some sort of mitigating strategies. Now we want to see some compliance strategy. Again, very similar to the ones that we discussed earlier, is the same things actually, is visibility over personal data. Make sure that you're reducing compliance on yourself, because at any time you can very clearly say, no, we know where our data goes. We're very clear of where the streams are. We know where the access points are. We know where the endpoints are. We know that there is no vulnerability in our system. That is one way to ensure compliance. Another way is obviously regulatory compliance intelligence. You want to have somebody who is ahead of the law, knows what they're, how to make sure if the data protection bill comes into place, how to enable it within the organization, somebody who has clarity into all of that. Another is obviously privacy monitoring, incident management, all of these points that we discussed earlier. I'm not going to go into details. If anybody has questions, I'm happy to elaborate. But there are a whole host of ways in which we can mitigate compliance penalties. And I would say the first starting point is having data accessibility and visibility, knowing where your data is. Another is training and awareness within the organization. The third is having privacy policy and processes, which is making sure that there is a privacy best practice within the organization. And if you are ever collecting data, you have a privacy terms and conditions, let's say a privacy policy by the organization for particular projects. Another is having the presence of a data protection officer or somebody with a designated responsibility that's looking after monitoring, incident management, if there are any, who's basically overseeing the data protection responsibilities of the organization. And the last, of course, is that if there is a possibility, tie up with or have an advisory session or whatever with an organization that can guide you through this, that can guide you through how to implement the data protection bill when it comes into force, or can guide you through how to set up privacy best practices within the organization and building up relationships in that particular ecosystem. So these are some of the big pointers. I do realize it's quite high level and abstract, but in case of any questions, I'm happy to take it at the moment.
Sure. Thank you, Anisha. Yes, we have a couple of questions. We can answer those. So the first question is there any basic checklist, basic activities that we need to take care for an NGO for a data protection?
Yeah, so this is exactly that the final sort of mitigation strategies that I was talking about, right? So the one thing is making sure that you have visibility into what data you're collecting, Another is making sure that you know that you aren't excessively collecting data. You know exactly the functions of the organization, so you know what purposes the data is being collected for. Making sure that you have good cybersecurity apparatus to protect the privacy. Obviously, that's another big point. And maybe even the setup of even if it's not a data protection officer, but somebody who's tasked with the responsibility of overseeing that your data is managed well within the organization. So having somebody to oversee all of these would be really important. But generally, if you're starting off a new project, I would say do a privacy impact assessment. It's not very difficult to do that. We're happy to discuss that further. What a data protection impact assessment is. Do it to make sure that you know where your checkpoints are. This will also help inform where in the company there are big privacy loopholes, and then you'll be able to fix it. So yeah, there are a couple of ways in which we can start off and move ahead with the process. Yeah.
Yeah. So the next question is, can you explain a bit about the cookies policies on the website, and can it be pervasive or not?
Cookies policies and sorry?
On the website, and can it be pervasive or not?
Possessive? I'm sorry?
It's pervasive.
Oh, persuasive. Okay. All right. Sorry. Yeah. Sorry. Persuasive. Yes. So cookies policy generally, again, is a privacy notice, right? They are telling you that there are cookies that are able to track your activities across the web. Watch out. Essentially, it is a privacy notice. What you want to do is it persuasive? I would argue, yes, some cookie notices are persuasive. There is legislation to ensure that, at least in the GDPR or across geographies, there is legislation to ensure that it is not coercive. But it'll tell you that, okay, at least now, if you look at European-based websites, you'll see something very clearly. They'll tell you your data is being used for the purposes of running this website, like it's really important, or it's being used for analytics, or it's used for third-party sharing. So you can tick the boxes, right? But it's also a bit of a challenge, because the minute you want to go to a website, you see all of this information, and then they give you a really long privacy notice that you have to read, and then you have to go there, and then they take you. It's kind of a bit of a runaround. So sure, they do make it much more difficult for you to give informed consent. Yeah, it can be persuasive in particular instances, but ideally, what they aren't necessarily, or at least the assumption is that the collection of sensitive personal data in that case is very low. It might be personal data, but it might not necessarily be sensitive personal data directly. It can be assumed, like if you're looking at a particular website, it can be assumed that you might be of a particular group, etc. But it's assumed sort of information, right? It's later on given its sensitiveness. But generally, when we collect data, there is an imperative that you make it as clear, as informed, as straightforward as you possibly can. But yeah, in some particular instances, cookies can be really persuasive. Yeah. I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
So the next question is, our organization collects and shares a lot of data, and we are in process of setting up a data protection and a privacy policy and a procedure for us and our partners. Can you give some reference documents where we can refer the procedure and practice of other organizations that are following in not-for-profit sector?
Sure, but absolutely, that can definitely be done. But the privacy policy of any enterprise is really dependent on the nature of the work that the enterprise does. Right, so the privacy policy of a grassroots level financial inclusion organization will be very different from the privacy policy of, let's say, a healthcare distributor, right? So it's kind of imperative that we understand the scope and responsibilities of what you ultimately intend to do. And then we can maybe contextualize it to a particular situation. So I wouldn't say universally there are privacy principles that exist universally, but the privacy policy for a particular organization is much more nuanced. But we can definitely share some examples, some abstract examples to start off. That can absolutely be done.
Sure. So one of the questions is, can we get the documents on how to do a data protection impact assessment?
Sure. Yeah. So that's actually a session. The data protection impact assessment sort of learning strategy is a session, but we can maybe put together a short primer on some of the points of a data protection impact assessment, and that might be able to help as a starting off point.
So the last question that I will take is, when the donor and the agencies are asking for the Aadhaar number of the beneficiaries, do we need to collect the full Aadhaar or a mask Aadhaar?
I'm sorry?
So they are asking that the donor agencies ask when they ask for a Aadhaar number of the beneficiaries. So do they have to collect the full Aadhaar or it's a mask Aadhaar will do?
So that really depends on, again, the functionality of what it's being used for. So if the functionality mandates that the Aadhaar number be collected, then that's absolutely fine. But you have to know that then the risk of compliance is much higher. The challenges of penalties, again, are much higher. But if it's not necessary that the full Aadhaar number is collected, there's no mandate. If you know there is no necessary, then you can come up. It's completely dependent on the functionality of what the number is being collected for.
So we are opening for a live question. So if anyone would like to ask a question, they can. Okay. So I'm just allowing.
Saurabh has raised the hand.
Yeah. Lisa, can you give me the host rights?
I'm sorry?
The host rights. Can you make me the host?
Oh, okay. Shall I make you the host, Jyoti?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, hello. Am I audible?
Yes.
Hi, Saurabh. Yeah.
Okay, so basically, this is the same question which was asked by Jyoti. So what we can collect? So suppose we want to collect the UID, Aadhaar number, and we can store it safely. We are confident that we can store it safely. So why do we collect is that we want to find the uniqueness of the people involved. So we want to make sure that two people are two people. They are not one people registering as two. So basically, we need to collect the whole Aadhaar number. So is it allowed or is it not allowed?
No, that's absolutely allowed. You can collect sensitive personal data with no inhibitions. The worry, again, as I pointed out, is that that data should be highly protected. And the privacy, it's not just a storage thing, like it's not just how well you can secure the data, but to make sure that there are no privacy challenges for the individuals that might come even later on, based on the fact that they gave you their full Aadhaar number. So,
what do you mean by challenges? So suppose I'm storing it and I'm not sharing it with anybody. So what is the privacy challenge?
So there might still be challenges. For example, you might be running some analytics and inadvertently you might be biased against certain groups of people, right? So, and this is not true even of the human beings involved. It can be an algorithmic bias, right? The algorithm could accidentally be biased against certain groups of people.
In that case, what is the solution?
There is no solution. You have to put together privacy. This is exactly why you have a privacy impact assessment. So you see where the challenges are and you find sort of solutions to mitigate, because these are very nuanced project-centric questions. So in a particular instance, it might be absolutely okay to collect full Aadhaar number and process. But in particular instances, it might not be at all, because, for example, there's something which is called the identifying principle, which is, even if you just collected Aadhaar number and you have it in one data set, and in another data set, let's say you have sensitive information like, let's say their religious identity, and let's say they have their intersex identity, whatever, in another database. There might be instances in which these databases might, even without the awareness or active use of the people involved, might be linked together and you'll be able to identify a person, right? And that might put that person's sometimes liberties at risk, freedom at risk, sometimes even their life at risk. So it's those are some of the challenges that we have, and you have to do an impact assessment and you have to do all of these things to make sure that those are not there.
So these impact assessments are done by whom? Like we ourselves or some outward agencies?
There are tons of folks that do impact assessments. For example, you can do it in-house. If you can't do it in-house, and DSCI does impact assessments, there are a variety of organizations that do this. We can have a list sent to you.
So they give you some certification. On basis of that certification, you can store the data.
Exactly. So they tell you that this project is safe to hold. Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you can also do this in-house, but then that takes a lot more work because you need to know the scope, etc.
Our internal assessment may not be valid for people outside. So maybe it is
Yes,
more important that you do some certification kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's always easier, especially if you're tying up with a third-party organization. They might ask, "Have you done an impact assessment on the project?"
Okay. Thank you so much.
No worries. Yes. Yeah, Jyoti, I think we have some other questions, right?
Yeah, so I would like to, Sana, can you ask a question?
Yeah. First of all, Anisha, thank you so much for the informative webinar. And I think it's on the exact right time that we needed it. So actually, as I shared, we are in process of like setting up a data protection policy and privacy policy for us. And we are in process of like setting up these procedures, like procedure for de-identifying data, data storage access. So like I just wanted to understand, like when we just set up all these things, how should we like make sure that our partners should also follow these procedures? So what are the like compliance procedure for the partners, and how do we ensure that these policies are being followed like that, the way we want it?
Sure. So again, it's very dependent on the project or very dependent on the partner that you're tying up with, right? So you want to see if they're just going to use the data for a particular processing activity or they're going to be taking care of all of it. So there's a bit of nuance that's involved in this conversation. But generally, while tying up with an organization, you can very clearly say that this is our standard. This is the standard that we expect on an organization level. Like this is the security standard, this is the privacy standard, this is the whatever, whatever. So you can give them a very clear trajectory of what is an expectation in-house. And this is the standard that you've been maintaining in-house. And they would have to either match that or comply with that. So they'll have to match it and say, okay, if this is your security protocol, this is the security protocol that we have, it matches. If this is your privacy best practice protocol and this is another privacy, if this is our privacy best practice protocol, it matches. So it's important that you have sit down conversations and you see if all of these are aligned with each other, what previous data protection impact assessment results that they've gotten, have they been certified, for example. This is also Saurabh's question, right? If they've been certified, there is a certain sense of trust that they are doing it. So there's a whole host of ways in which you can check if your partner organizations are held to the standard.
Sure, Tanisha, thank you so much. Just one request, if you could like share a draft policy or like any sample data protection policy that we can refer to, so that will be really helpful. Thank you.
Sure. But what I would request from your end is that you tell us exactly the scope of the organization and what exactly you're working with, so we are able to send you one that's closer to that organization, like something that fits the profile of that more than a very abstract.
Okay. Should I share right now, or do you want me to write separately?
No, take your time. But yeah, whenever you can.
Okay, sure.
Thank
Thank
you,
you. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Unfortunately, because of the time constraint, we might not be able to take the other live questions, but please post your questions in the Q&A group. We will ensure that you will get a response post the webinar. So I would like to just quickly, showcase what are the softwares which are available on Big Tech, which can help you to also, mitigate a lot of risk, which Anisha has also mentioned, right? So I just want to quickly share my screen. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, Mahendra, we can see the screen.
Okay. All right, so these are some of the software which are available. So if I just want to quickly name them, Bitdefender is one. You'll find Veritas is another one, and you also have Norton LifeLock, and we also have Quick Heal, which is not listed here, but it's also there in the Big Tech platform. So here we are trying to project what are the different options which you have in Bitdefender. For an example, for Mac, for internet user, and if it's going to be like 1 user versus 3 users or 5 users. And this pricing, whatever is there, which is shown here, is all a subsidized price. When you compare to a market price, it's way higher. Unlike if you come to the big tech, it's going to be a subsidized price from the donors. So I would encourage all the NGOs to look at these options. You can always look at our big tech website also. If you need further clarifications, you can also send an email to us, or you can also call us, which is listed on our website. We'll be happy to help you. But I think these are some of the things which can definitely help you to kind of mitigate some of the risks. Let me move on. So I would like to welcome Gunjan, who would be walking us through My Kartavya app. And that's also part of the NASSCOM Foundation, where they are part of the corporate volunteering and engaging platform. So over to you, Gunjan.
Thank you so much, Mahendra. So good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Gunjan. I lead the corporate volunteering and engagement with NASSCOM Foundation. So talking about in detail about what My Kartavya is and the idea behind it. We within the nonprofit sector, we a lot of times, we have these issues that while we're working on the on-ground projects, we are in need of people who can help us, guide us, and support us, and throughout the process. So largely, My Kartavya application, the portal is a very unique, curated, volunteering and engagement portal that we have worked out for the corporates as well as for the non-profits, where for the corporates, they'll find the wide range of, the opportunities within the non-profits that we are already associated with, to kind of create a meaningful support and a better social impact. It's also a great way, for the non-profits to share the opportunities, because as I said that yes, on the ground, you are working, but there are a lot of times, there are these smaller organizations, the grassroots level organization, who don't know how to do things. There are these whole lot of extra costs. So let's say if we talk about somebody needs to revamp your website, the kind of cost that's involved, and because that requirement takes a backseat because of the financial cost. That's where we come in picture. We take those opportunities to the corporates and share the further details with them, get the corporate volunteers, help the non-profits to work on the such requirements. Mahendra, we can go on the next slide. So as I said that why My Kartavya, what is in for as a non-profit to you guys, what's benefit? One is you'll be able to kind of connect with the industry volunteers for both the long-term, short-term. As I said that it doesn't matter that what is the thematic area that you're working on. You might be working with kids, you might be working with elderly, youth, environment as an issue, community, development in the community mobilization. It doesn't matter. At the end of the day, your requirement should be valid and will help you get the right set of volunteers with the right skill set, to work very closely with you on that. The portal is free of cost for the non-profit. So there is not any cost involved in it. So what you can do is you can simply go register on My Kartavya portal, under the non-profit section. Mention your details and the kind of volunteering opportunities or where you need the help of the volunteers. That's where we start working on it, showcasing the non-profit partners on the website. So on the website we do have a section wherein of course, being NASSCOM Foundation and the ecosystem of of NASSCOM, we do have a huge list of corporates who are working with us very closely, with our CSR projects and just employee volunteering and engagement. These are the X number of organizations, list of organizations who are listed, and pick and choose activity as per their convenience. As I said, skill-based volunteering, the major challenge, that comes, we do see a lot of time, the smaller organization face, and it's not just the smaller organization. I have been receiving a lot of requests. We do receive requests, from the bigger organizations as well. As I said, website revamping, creating a social media strategy, putting a monitoring evaluation plan in place, kind of come up with a software where you can you can kind of create dashboards, that could be useful for the non-profit. Let's say if it's a school, for the attendance and all that, or it could be used for the monitoring evaluation. So what you need to do is just register on My Kartavya portal, share us with, the requirement that you have, and at the end, then just kind of sit back, relax, and we'll get the right volunteer to work with you. Other than that, what will also kind of, to build a non-profit brand. So a lot of times there are these long-term projects wherein we are working with the non-profits and there are corporate volunteers. We highlight them, on our website, the work that is being done by the these non-profits. So you do get a brand like NASCOM Foundation and My Kartavya, wherein we are talking about more about the work that is being done, and the impact that we have been able to make together with the help of the volunteers, the partner organization. We also have a link here. Mahendra, there's a link also, or I can post the link in the chat box for everyone to kind of, in case if you want to register, we would request non-profits to kind of come here and register your non-profit. Because once you register, then only we'll be able to address and take all the volunteer requirements from your end. Thank you so much, Mahendra.
So the link is here. You can just click, go to this link, and Gunjan will also post in the Q&A session, the chat box, so that you can just click and explore that. Okay. Well, with that, I just want to thank everyone for joining the webinar. Thanks Anisha, Gunjan, and Jyoti for taking time to present this, and thank you all the NGO organizations who have joined, and I'm hoping that this session will help you to kind of mitigate some of the risk, and it will streamline a lot of things from your ongoing daily operations perspective. We will also roll out a short survey after this webinar, so feel free to let us know if you find anything which is going to be some areas where we can work towards, or some of the things which has really helped you. So we would love to hear from you. So with that, thank you for joining and signing off for today. Thanks everyone.
Thank you everyone.
Thanks everyone. Goodbye.